Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Thanks for joining us on the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast today. First of all, just to let you know that you can subscribe to the journal if you go to the Journal of Biophilic Design.com website and go to subscribe or become a member. You can become a member of the Journal of Biophilic Design and get access to free events and priority booking on lots of things, as well as access to all the journals that we've got online. But I am excited today to be joined by Luke Engleback. He is founder of Studio Engleback. He's got 40 years experience as a designer at all scales. He established Studio Engleback in 1998. He's taught in the UK, abroad, regularly presenting papers on Ecourbanism and biodiversity, climate change adaptation and health. He's a board member and former chair of the Landscape Foundation, and he also sits on the Landscape Institute Policy and Public Affairs Committee and the Midland Design Panel, the Cambridge Quality Panel, and the South Downs National Park. And I'm sure there's other things that you do because, Luke, the more I talk to you, the more little things are emerging. So listeners, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Luke. So thanks very much, Luke. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Lovely. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do? Obviously, I've given a top line there, but...
Well, I trained as a landscape architect. It's probably because my father was an architect, and architect. There's no space to move in that one. But my mother was a spinner and a weaver, and so the two things are really quite interesting because the spinning, I think, just making stuff out of threads and then turning that into cloth is something else. And then she used to use vegetable dyes, so she was always collecting skins or flowers or something, and then depending on the mordant you use depends on what color you get and the fix on the fabric. So that was interesting from one side, and then the other side was looking at the architecture and trying to understand spaces and how things work. So that's the basis for me. Then going off to Edinburgh College of Art, where they had a brand new landscape architecture course under a guy called David Skinner. And he had been one of the first students of an amazing Scottish landscape architect who made his career in America called Ian McHarg. Ian McHarg wrote a seminal book that came out in 1969 called Design with Nature. And he was a real force to be reckoned with. So this has required reading for us, and that is how I got interested in that side of landscape, as it were, because landscape architecture is about problem solving in various ways.
Yeah.
It can be in the urban realm, it can be how you put roads through countryside, or the current concern at the moment is putting electrical cables through it. It's all of those things, and so you have to think in many scales, from the big scale right the way down to how do you detail something so it can be built. Yeah. Or planting plans or whatever specifications. So you do need to have this kind of broad spectrum, and yet you also have the precision as well. And so that interests me. But even as a child, I was interested, particularly at the time, when I was sort of 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, in rocks.
Yeah.
And so I was really genned up on rocks and stuff. But living in the countryside, yeah, you're always aware of nature as well. Yeah. And you're playing in it, you're making dens in it. Yeah. That's lucky. I mean, a lot of kids don't get that advantage. So those are all basic things behind what, yeah, I've been doing ever since.
Yeah. Amazing. I mean, obviously we met and we was chatting about biophilic design, and it was at the Healthy Cities conference. Obviously you won an award there, which we're going to talk about the project that you did a bit later on. But and obviously biophilic design is a big thing for you. We're going to talk about eco-urbanism, so we're going to talk about all these things. But can you maybe chat a little bit about how biophilic design is important right now, and how we can manifest it in our built environment?
It's really important. I mean, one of the key things about biophilic design. It's just getting people closer to nature. We've just got this divide, this schism between us living in our automated urban environments, increasingly needing our electronic cloud and all the rest of it, and avoiding everything else. So there's a divide and a lack of sensitivity. And there are people who are out there in the urban realm. I met some people at the same conference, Nature Vibes, with lots of Zs on it. A guy called Douglas who was actually particularly concerned about minority kids who don't feel as safe in nature, and he was trying to get them to get out and enjoy it and see it, and even sort of camp out overnight as well.
Yeah.
Because then you really get much closer to nature, and it becomes really important. But it's important anyway because we rely on natural systems for everything, the economy, our health. There's nothing that we have in our human world that isn't based on nature. And yet, as Paul Hawken, sort of entrepreneur and environmentalist said, we have an economy that tells us it's okay to destroy nature in real time. And that has to be wrong. This is linear way of looking at how we take something, make it, and throw it away. And this is really behind this big move towards the circular economy, or cradle to cradle thinking, circular design, or regenerative design. And of course, landscape architecture is all about regenerative design, really, because we're dealing with soils and we're dealing with plants, which are by nature regenerative. So that's why it's important to infuse what we do. And I think more and more as we live, more and more people live in cities, and we live perhaps more and more densely in many areas as well. So if that's the case, we have to try and reconnect even harder. That's the way it seems to me.
Yeah, exactly. And biophilic design really tries to encourage that, doesn't it? Really,
it absolutely does. I mean, we just we were talking about Erich Fromm, who was a psychoanalyst who understood this. This is in the early 60s, and then Edward O. Wilson and his famous slim book, Biophilia, which is poetic. I mean, Wilson was also an amazing scientist who wrote some extraordinary stuff. And I quite like one of his books, which came out just before the millennium, called Consilience, which is about the unity of knowledge. And I don't think I've got the exact quote here, but it's along the lines that there's so much information coming to us all over the place that somehow we need some people who can synthesize this and take that knowledge and think about it carefully and come up with the right answers. And I thought, well, that sounds a little bit to me like what landscape architects are trying to do. Yeah. Because we do try to take this wide range of things which aren't necessarily on the linear list or pecking order in a project management thing. We go, well, actually, there's some other things playing in here. And sometimes the small voices need to be heard quite loudly early on in a project, not at the end as a bit of decorating. So the anti-biophilic design thing are earlier architects that I worked with in my younger days who say, oh, well, landscape architecture, it's all about rearranging the geraniums. No, it's not. It's something much more fundamental than that. And what we're trying to say now is the stuff that we put in between buildings. And remember, in cities, there's a lot of space in between the buildings.
Yeah.
In fact, in the street, and it depends on the city, there's between 20 and 40% of the space in the city is taken up by streets. Most streets are pretty ghastly and paved. Can't we do that differently? So it's really interesting. But 2 days ago in Paris, there was a vote to actually green up streets.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was a sizable majority to actually green up the streets. Because Paris, if you've ever been there, it can be very attractive. It also can be very, very hot.
Yes, you're
It
right.
doesn't have that much greenery.
Mm.
There are some boulevards with trees in it, but there aren't that many parks. There's not that much green.
Yeah.
And so a lot more people, when we've had European heat waves, a lot more people die in cities like that.
Mm.
But otherwise, and in fact, this whole thing about biophilic design, just getting closer to nature and having more of it, feeds into concerns about what we're trying to do about climate change.
Yes.
We need more vegetation in cities in every which way, every form. Uh, it all adds up. I think there was a study that was done by CURE, the Centre for Urban Ecology, about 20 plus years ago. They were based at Manchester University, that said if you had 10% more vegetation in cities, it would lower the urban heat island by about 4 degrees.
Yeah.
Or as they were saying at the time, or we will keep it the same as now as it when we actually hot up later in the century. So that's an important consideration in terms of dealing with that. And also recently, I think it was in April of last year, a large number, 2,500 almost, women over 64 in Switzerland successfully sued their own government for not doing enough on climate change on the basis that it's going to harm their future health.
Good for them. We need more of
and
that.
that was done through the European Court of Human Rights. But it's a really important thing that we need to make that connection, and biophilic design is part of doing that.
Yeah.
Another aspect which I found fascinating is while we were in Liverpool at that conference, at the same time was something which wasn't on my radar. It was a symposium on probiotic cities.
Oh, okay.
That interested me because some years ago I was in New Zealand meeting. Well, it was to see family, but I also had a meeting with a guy called Professor Woodward at Auckland University. I wanted to see him because he had written a book I was reading at the time, which was about climate change and health. When I got to see him, I said, "Oh, well, yes, no, I'm interested in that." So I've moved on. I'm now looking at how we encounter microbial old friends by walking through greenways in cities. And he had his postgraduate students at the time walking through different greenways and green streets in Auckland and taking swabs on the surface of the skin and just inside their mouths to see what they were picking up. And that's fascinated me because this is part of what we call the exposome. It's what we're exposed to through life, right the way through life. And it has, to a large degree, that's how we get our microbiomes, without which we cannot function. So we're more microbe than we are human cells. Obviously, we evolved with them, but there's an order of magnitude more of microbes in and on us than there are human cells in our body. We absolutely need them. So while we get obsessed with germs and things like that, it's actually important to have a very diverse biome. And a study was done fairly recently, the last couple of years, it was published, looking at 2 day centers for preschool kids in Finland. They looked at 2. One was the control, where it's a standard setup, very clean and tidy and all the rest of it. The other one, they introduced, as they put it, sods and leaf litter from the forest into the play area for kids to get dirty. Probably upset their mums a bit. But after a year, they came and did some swabs on the kids to see what was changing. And they found that in that period, the children who'd been in the messy natural play area had got a much more diverse biome than the kids who were in the clean areas. but more importantly, the percentage of pathogens was lower in the guys who had been playing in the messier area, because you need diversity to keep matters under control.
Yeah.
So there's a reason, and I wonder whether that, I mean, that in a way, that's a sort of a biophilic play area, isn't it?
It is, exactly.
And so, but it shows the benefits, and there's a real benefit. So fast forward, well, actually, a little bit earlier, I'd also met a guy called Dr. Payam Dadvan. This is when I was talking at a conference in Italy on nature-based solutions. He was a medical doctor working at the International Health Institute in Barcelona, although he had done his medical stuff in London. And he was looking at a cohort of children, quite a large cohort, about 380, to see whether their cognition was affected by whether they'd been brought up in mainly grey or green areas. And he found that the children who had the greener environments, even within an urban area, were doing better. And I asked him, well, was that because they're from richer families? He said, no, we made sure that we sort of equaled that out in the results. So there is this connection with nature, which is actually fundamentally important to us. Yeah. So fast forward to the thing we missed last year, and it was called Probiotic City. And it was addressing the aero microbiome. It's the microbes in the air all around us. And apparently, on average, and I guess this is the big average, we breathe in about 6 million bacteria and something like 60,000 fungal spores every day.
Crazy.
And that is affected greatly by the circumstance we are in.
Yeah.
So if you're doing your forest bathing or Shinrin-juku, as we know from the Japanese, it does make you feel better. And perhaps one of the reasons it makes you feel better is because the air that you're breathing in has not only got a different microbiome because of what's around it, but it's also got other vapors and things which are coming off the vegetation. So which we also know can actually trigger things within your body to work well or not so well. I mean, think of aromatherapy. It's a kind of a natural version of that.
Yeah.
So it's I found that quite interesting, and apparently one of the things, there was a paper that came out and was published in Nature about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I took notice because it talked about landscape designers. It was called Designing for Better Health. Okay. And this is exactly why we were both at that conference, and I've been going there for several years. But this looked at the response of the biome in the air related to the variety of vegetation where you are, and the strategic location of, shall we say, oases of green in a city, which can make a connection with that. So if you're relatively close to a small park, which is quite biodiverse, some of that value may be drawn along the street, but just by ventilation and winds and things like that.
Yeah.
So and I find that interesting only because for me, it starts to give a technical reason why the biophilic thing seems to be working. It's not just airy fairy. There is some grit in there. I think that just as we're saying about the sheep, did we mention that on this talk, or maybe we were talking beforehand?
It might have been before. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, I should just introduce that now. I was just looking into deficiencies in vitamins in certain sheep. It was actually on Farming Today 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I just happened to be dealing with a project which is in the countryside on sandy soils, where they give supplements to the sheep, which contain, amongst other things, very small amounts of cobalt and zinc, which help them make the vitamins they need to get the energy out of the food they're eating. And without that, they have a problem. But the farmer who was talking on farming today said, well, naturally, sheep will actually find goat willow and nibble at that when they feel they need it.
Yeah.
And it turns out that goat willow is called that because it was fodder for goats, is a natural accumulator of certain micronutrients that you need. And sheep seem to know that that's good for them. Well, I just wonder whether we're just hardwired by evolving with nature of things that we know we need.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So it's just by way of example, it's always saying, this is why you need this stuff near you.
Yeah.
And as a child, I remember if you stung yourself on a stinging nettle, look for a dock leaf and rub it on the sting, and the sting goes away. And dock leaves always seem to grow close to stinging nettles.
Yeah.
This is something I learned from my grandmother. So these are basic things that we've learned over the years, and it's passed down. But if you live in a city, you won't know that because that isn't part of your everyday experience.
Yeah.
I think the idea of trying to get more biodiversity, more greening into cities in every which way, it's more of an everyday thing.
Yeah.
Then we just need to find the mechanisms to tell the stories. We need people like Nature Vibes and others, City Farm, who actually spread that knowledge. A lot of primary schools are doing this already in terms of having nature gardens and growing gardens.
Yeah. Forest schools.
Yeah, exactly. So it is something that we need to feed into, I think. Yeah. But as designers, we need to design for it. And it's often quite a struggle to get that happening because we don't have the space to do it because it's not been allowed in the plan.
Yeah.
And why is that? Well, a lot of it is because there's siloized thinking.
Yes.
And you think about this problem, for example, it's raining in the street. We've got to get rid of that so it doesn't flood. We'll put it in the drain and we'll shoot it off somewhere else. It all disappears.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that does work, but it also has some problems because you end up with point loading of pollution at the other end and all the rest and flooding. Whereas if you were to go down a different route and have let's call it a more biophilic approach and have rain gardens in your street.
Yes.
First of all, you need a slightly wider street to put them in if you're going to design it from scratch, but you can often retrofit them. But if you have that, not only is it dealing with a pulse of water that's coming off, which often may block a drain, and then you end up with puddles and splashing and the rest of it. If you've got that, it's also helping biodiversity. You're hydrating urban soils, so you're trying to get some carbon that's sequestered from the plants back into the soils. In summer, it gives you some cooling to make you feel better. And so there's a whole series of other things, connected things. And this is why we need to do systems thinking rather than silo thinking. And you asked me about eco-urbanism. It's always about system thinking. It's about thinking about the system, thinking out the big thing, and then zooming in. Yeah. But about it in an elastic way, in and out. You know, if you only sit in one little silo and solve that tiny little problem, that's all very well, but it doesn't necessarily solve other problems. It may create other problems.
Exactly. I'm going to ask you about eco-urbanism in a sec. I just to sort of circle back a bit, and that's the reason. Just what you're saying there is the reason why I'm doing this podcast. And some people might be listening to this going, "Well, why isn't it about interior design? You know, why isn't it just about architecture?" The point is that we don't, like you're saying, this siloed thinking. We have to, if we're going to be designing, if we're specifying something, to have that knowledge, even if it's like sort of top line knowledge that we can then go away and research some more, or reach out to the experts to. But if we're in charge of specifying, we can specify better. And for me, the more nature and more life and more, you know, biosystems that are in our our built environment, it's got to be better. So thank you for coming on, first of all, Luke, and also explaining this in such a good way with all these amazing examples. How you remember all this, I have no idea, but they're really inspiring, and it's sort of it's a no-brainer. This whole biome thing, these sort of microbiomes. We all kind of like we're having our Yakult in the morning and all this kind of thing, for our gut biome. And so we're understanding that, but we're forgetting that, like you just said, the stuff we're breathing in, the stuff that's on our skin. And if we're in a negative, a non-biophilic environment, if you want, one that's very, you know, sort of concrete, not much natural materials, it's all plastics, reflective surfaces, all that kind of thing, and there's not much natural plants and things around us, then that's going to have an impact on our natural system, our internal biophilia, if you want, our internal biophilic design. So I'm sort of going off on a bit of a tangent there, but eco-urbanism then, you mentioned it's like a system and it's a systems approach to regenerative city building and also repair, and the fact you can also retrofit it and things. Can you tell us a little bit about eco-urbanism and why we need it really?
Well, the starting from when I was studying in Edinburgh, McHarg was a landscape architect who started to deconstruct what was around in terms of his plan to see how things would work. So he was looking at areas in Philadelphia, for example, and it was a layered system where you start to take out the bits to see how they work and put them back together again. Whereas rather than being less technical about it, shall we say, more emotions. It's not about emotions, it's about solving problems.
Mm.
But you can solve problems in a way that also gives lots of other opportunities. And that's the key. So that's the basis. And then I was at a conference in Geneva. It was called the Europan conference, and Europan was a competition for people, architects under 40s. This is what's considered young in architecture, to innovate on projects. And I'd been involved in a couple, both in Holland with Dutch teams, and they were both winners, which was kind of great. So I was there, and I came across a book called Ecourbanism by Miguel Rana, and subsequently got to know Miguel and did some work with him, along with my friend Dr. Mike Wells, who's an ecologist. But Miguel wrote the book Ecourbanismo, and he looked really at 60 projects which he thought were doing this harmonious nature and building thing. And it just happened that one of the projects that he looked at, Park Beert in Mallorca, was something that Mike and I had been working on before we set up our own respective practices. So that was, we thought, oh, that sounds good. I think we'll nab that title and just work at it. So since then, of course, you have to apply your own experience and thinking. And it seems to me that this way of the problem with urbanism up until that point was a plan's done by architects generally. Sometimes it's big architecture, and then you green it up. And I thought, well, no, but this is how it always was. Can you? I remember the first job for quite a well-known architecture practice in 1984, saying, well, can you tell us, we're going to want a tree here. Can you tell us what kind? I mean, really? Is it right even to have a tree there? Should it be something else? But no, that's what they wanted to know. So this idea has to be turned on its head. And we now call it landscape-led approach. Mm. And eco-urbanism has always been this landscape-led approach. It was informed very much by McHarg's design with nature. Go with it. There was another guy who came a bit later who is called Michael Hoff, which was cities and natural processes. So it's about understanding how do these processes work and how can you harness them as part of your design. I mean, you've probably heard out there ecosystem services. These are the benefits, it's a very anthropogenic way of looking at nature, but it's the benefits that humans get from processes coming out of nature, coming from a stock of natural assets, whether it's a mountain or a lake or a trees or a whole collection of them. How do those ecosystems work? Some of those things that come out the other end, we need them for our health, we need them for our economy. And that realization really started getting going in a big way after the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, in a series of great heavy tomes called The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. And so that thing's been running for a while, and we know a lot about it now. So that's one side of things. And then the other side is just trying to get this elastic thinking, because the professions generally work at one scale and become specialism. Well, certainly when I started, so you'd either be working at the planning scale or you'd be at the detailed design scale, and never the twain shall meet. But actually, if you're doing top down, you've got to allow enough space for these other things to happen. And this is what doesn't happen, which is why you need, I think, a landscape-led approach to doing this, so that you can make sure that the living critical infrastructure that we need in cities, there's enough space for it, but also there's enough light. So I sit on a number of design panels, and it is not unusual to see, oh, we're going to have this natural water system, this pond area in this street, and it's on the north side of the building, so it's going to be in shade. Well, ponds need light to work. Yeah. That doesn't kind of add up. So you need to have some basic knowledge about how systems work if you're going to design for them. And it's also the proximity of one type of thing to another, because nothing exists in isolation. And so they've got to have connectivity, they've got to have a relative sympathetic nature of one thing next to the other, so that you can maximize the benefits that you're going to get out of it. So I talked earlier about a little bit about drainage, but if you want to get your street greening to work, it's got to be linked with drainage, even if it's not rain gardens, even if it's just making sure that you've got enough hydration in the soil so that the trees can grow. And more importantly, when it's hot in the summer, you get the cooling not just from the shading, but from transpiration. So this is the water being drawn up through and evaporating off from the leaves. It's a slightly powered system, so it's using some solar energy to do that. But the physics of it means that as it's evaporating, you get some cooling. And that will only work if you've actually got some water underneath to go into the roots to actually make that happen. If you haven't got that, then you're not going to get the cooling you want. And certainly during those very hot heat spells that we get increasingly often now, and I've certainly witnessed them in places like Paris and other cities, just the plant will wilt and just not doing the job you want them to do because they haven't got what they need. So you need to think and put it all together. It's not rocket science, really. It's kind of sensible.
Yeah, exactly. This is systems thinking. I mean, when you
they all happen at once. They don't happen in silos. There was an amazing lady called Donella Meadows. She was one of the authors for The Limits to Growth, which was first published in 1972. And she was an early system scientist using these giant mainframe computers back in the day. And she said, well, mostly people like to think one or two things at once, but not really many more than that. But systems happen at different levels and different scales all the time. And so if you just narrow your mind to one thing, then you're going to be missing out on rather a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about some of the projects that you've done and you've worked on and you've designed. Because because you are a systems thinker and you draw in this of eco-urbanism, you bring on biophilic design, so you're incredibly well read and you speak to a lot of people and you listen and process. So I'd like to just kind of explore maybe a design that you've done that you'd want to share with us.
Well, maybe I can give you a snapshot of a few different ones.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Before I set up my my studio in the late 90s, I worked for a very interesting engineering firm in Soho. They were interesting because they just did things very differently.
Yeah.
And one of the projects we were working on with Richard Rogers was in Florence, in Italy. Florence gets very, very hot and stuffy um, in the summer, particularly in the afternoon. It's at the bottom of a hill, and it's on the eastern side of the plain that goes out towards Pisa. And we were the Battle McCarthy were looking at energy use and trying to minimize energy use in buildings. So what they wanted to do is called passive ventilation, was to encourage breezes to go under the building, between the buildings, and so that you didn't have to use air conditioning. Florence has a river going through the River Arno, which famously flooded, destroying a huge amount of art in 1968. But the great advantage of that is that there's a great deal of data about how the river floods and all the rest of it. So we knew that on this site we needed to attenuate a lot of water. And Richard Rogers was very keen to have that as part of the design. I think he originally showed it as one huge pond or huge lake, but lakes draw down and they don't look quite so nice if you don't have water going in the summer, then get a bit smelly. So we suggested, well, actually, maybe we do it as a series of smaller ones. And because things get very hot and stuffy in the afternoon in the summer, maybe what we should be doing is trying to capture breezes and funnel them so that we can actually get something happening. And more importantly, we can funnel them over the top of water to chill them down. So that was really the idea, is that when the hills behind Florence heat up during the morning, you start to pull in breezes from the sea across the plain towards it. And then if we had a funnel-shaped plan, there was a park in front of this new urban quarter, we could funnel the wind and speed it up slightly and pass it over water, and then that would be drawn through buildings which are on stilts, what we call them pilotti, and it could keep the area cooler. Well, moving from that scale to a slightly larger and longer term scale, we were involved just over 20 years ago on the 30-year plan to expand Ashford, which is a small town in Kent. And it was going to double in size with 32,000 new homes, 28,000 new jobs. That was the idea. And we worked with urban initiatives to do that. The struggle at the time was to show that this really ought to be landscape led. It was very much urban design led. We got there in the end, and we did a major piece of work which started looking at the landscape you're going to expand into. Which bits should you use and which bits shouldn't you?
Yeah.
We use what was called a landscape character assessment. Landscape character is the way the United Kingdom addressed something which came in just after that full time or in full force. It was the European Landscape Convention, not to be confused with anything to do with EU. It's actually signed up by 43 countries in Europe, and it's about not just valuing lovely landscapes, but all landscapes, which is fundamental if you want to have a biophilic approach, I guess. And the way Britain decided to fulfill its obligations was to do a landscape character assessment. So we use that and a way of trying to assess the qualities, sensitivities of landscapes to development, which had been pioneered as part of the Living Landscapes project in the early noughties by a guy called Stephen Warnock. And I worked with my very old college friend and still collaborator, Louise Hooper, who knows a great deal about that. She worked with Warnock on the first trial of this, and so we did this in 2004 and 5, looking at 120 square miles of land around Ashford, field by field, putting together groups of fields with like qualities and assessing them against 42 different criteria. And we worked in pairs to do it, because if you're making a decision in the field, you kind of need someone to bounce that off to see if you're getting a joint view. And we still went back and checked all of these results so we could get a kind of an even approach. But the important thing on all of that was that we got a better idea of which areas we really had to avoid, which ones that might be open for development. But there was a knock-on from that. The landscape around Ashford, like so many around, up and down the country, had changed a lot with changed agricultural practice. So up until the 60s, there was a lot more livestock, small fields, hedges, cows belly deep in buttercups and all that kind of thing. But that had been swept away to make much larger fields, which were growing canola for oil, or oilseed rape it's called, and wheat. And when you have arable land, when it rains, the water runs off much more quickly. It doesn't hold as much water as does a pasture land with long grass in it. The consequence of that was that they had a series of heavy flooding events around 2000, which caused millions and millions of pounds worth of damage. Even though the Environment Agency had built in some flood retention areas, those dams were overtopped.
Yeah, yeah.
And the reason was that if you narrow all of your things down to one system of last resort, it makes it very vulnerable. And at the time, we said, well, look, really, you need to put back the crinkles into this landscape, patch waters across the whole thing. And I remember a senior lady at the Environment Agency saying, over my dead body, no, we won't have control over it. I said, well, if you've got enough of these things in there, you won't need control, because you will be putting the function back into the landscape.
Yeah.
So it was a bone of contention at the time. I think we can see with hindsight that it wasn't such a crazy thought to actually put function back into the landscape. And if I can just say, we think of ourselves as a landscape with lots of trees and hedges, but a huge amount of those have been pulled up since the 1960s as we changed our agricultural systems. Almost 400,000 kilometers. So the thing that sets the British and particularly the English landscape apart from others is that we have more hedges, or did have more hedges than any other landscape in the world, really. And so that was our special quality. But we don't have very much woodland, because if you think about it, our woodland was actually the hedges with hedgerow trees. If you take out 400,000 kilometers, if you think of that in terms of a type of woodland, that's a lot of woodland.
Yeah, yeah.
It changes the nature of how landscapes work, because when you take those out, you're taking out the ditches, you're taking out the ponds that are in between. You're just evening everything down to a sameness.
Yeah.
And so when you have a difference in climate, you get heavier rainfall, it can't cope with it. So one of the things we were looking at all these years ago on Ashford was, first of all, was at this big scale that I spoke about, it was the fact that the North Atlantic current, we call it the Gulf Stream sometimes, was starting to show signs of slowing up because of melting ice from Greenland. But at the time, it won't happen. We're much more worried about it now. We know that it happened in the past. It happened nearly 10,000 years ago, and it put Northern Europe back into an ice age for about 1,000 years. But it is a thing. I won't go into the mechanics of it, but basically, if you have melting fresh water going into very salty water, it dilutes it, and so the way that current works means it's disrupted, and it doesn't carry the heat to where we are here, and so it could lead to other problems. But it also affects how storms happen over Europe, and I was looking particularly at this stage about storms going over Europe, which normally split and go over Scotland, and they go down to the Bay of Biscay. But they'd noticed that during the 90s, there'd been an increased number of large storms which are going through the along the English Channel, notably the great storm of 30 odd years ago, but there have been others as well. So I said, well, if you're going to build something, we really need to take some of the energy out of the wind by planting more trees on the edge of Ashford, which is relatively lower lying. There's, just to the south of it is what's called the old Saxon shoreline, and because a lot of that southern part was sea at one point. So a spin-off from doing this careful analysis and understanding of the landscape, which is what I call landscape-led. It really, you just need to know how it works. We found that a lot of the similarities of these parcels of land we were looking at were based on old farm holdings, because someone would be looking after the land in a certain way. So we could then start, well, what would happen if you wanted to not only make the town a little bit safer from winds, but also from flooding? How much do you need to actually absorb that? And we were also looking at how much wastewater comes from 32,000 extra people going into a river, which becomes a chalk stream once it goes north through Wye. And a chalk stream or chalk river has a particularly stable temperature gradient because the water's coming through the chalk rather than coming over the top. So it supports a different ecology. And we were concerned, in my office anyway, that all this extra water going from an even larger sewage work with all the chemicals in there and the extra heat would change that dynamic. Is there another way of doing it? And we had looked at a number of things, one of which was using coppiced willows, which at the time were seen as a way of making energy. But in northern France, there was a firm that was actually using them to clean water by putting a leaky pipe underneath these lines of willows, and it was feeding with strained sewage full of nutrients, and they were growing like nobody's business. So it was a thought behind there. Is this a way of doing it where the microbes at the level of the roots can actually deal with a lot of the pathogens, and you do it in a completely different way? So we were looking at living machines, we were looking at reed beds, we were looking at these things. And when you start to look at it, I thought, well, for that number of houses, if you multiply that up, you could actually create combined heat and power for a third of those properties. I thought, well, that's interesting. How much space would that take? So it started, whereas the urban design was just looking, this is how much space you need for all of the roads and the factories. This is how much space you need for the residential areas and their little parklets and things like that. But there was no space allocated for all of these other bigger critical environmental infrastructure things at all. So we were ahead of the game saying, well, actually, you need to think about it. And here's one way that you can apply that thinking. So we were basing it initially on how to clean water with plants and how much space you would need, and then starting, well, what if we wanted to go net zero carbon? And we're talking over 20 years ago, so it's a way back. And we said, well, actually, you need this amount of woodland, managed woodland, and we showed it next door to the square kilometre areas which were for the new 30-year plan.
Yeah.
And it wasn't so crazy.
It's
But
not
more than
crazy.
that, coming out of our study, we'd looked at breaking down these large fields into what they used to be. I thought, well, what if we were to put back this woodland in a kind of a negative way, in terms of looking at the fields, instead of having open fields? What if those fields were little woodlands? And in between, you had a whole series of grassy rides which you need to access these patches of woodlands to keep them managed. Could you actually put back some of the heritage of the land back into a design, but in a completely different way, as a managed woodland, which has some essence of hundreds of year old uh, um, field boundaries, and the kind of, we call it time depth. It's something that you can see in the land that gives you a window onto the past. So you do that because that's the cultural side of things, but you've also got all of this leafiness. It's also drawing down all the carbon out of the atmosphere. It's dealing with flooding because you've changed the surface characteristic of the land. So instead of it all rushing down to cause a flood, it's been more evened out. So that was something that we took to a conference in Rome in 2007 about urban forestry and ecourbanism.
Just goes
Is
to
that thinking?
Yeah, just goes to show it can be done if you're thinking
Yeah,
about it and you know, and also it's presentation, isn't it? It's getting people to understand, getting them to, but these great examples, how things.
it's just thinking. It's just trying to think differently. And then you asked about that another project which is much smaller. It's 20, I think it's 26 homes,
Yeah.
which we were working with an amazing architect called Anne Thorne, who decided she didn't want to live in an old person's ghetto when she retired. So she and some friends got together a co-housing group. They found some land in Colchester and they built their little community, which is called Cannock Mill.
Yeah.
And we were asked to get involved in that. And she's very well known for doing low energy buildings called passive design. So you use the heat that we generate ourselves, you use the sun, you use natural materials, you use a lot of insulation, you have big green roofs and all the rest of it to make sure that your heating bills are as low as possible and your impact on the planet is as low as possible. And she wanted a low impact design for the landscape. And that's what we supplied, looking at the whole site for drainage, not just one bit. It had a middle pond in it, which was 900 years old, but we needed to make sure the water was the right quality going to it and that it didn't discharge too much into the nearby stream because there was a flooding issue there. So the way the site was designed was to act like a big sponge, to hold that water to do lots of things. But we also had areas for growing food, areas which are nature orientated. And the interesting thing on that design was that the old mill house, which was a listed building, they kept as a communal house. So that 3 times a week, food that they grow, they cook together, eat together. They have quiz nights there. They have lectures. They invite people in from the surrounding area to enjoy socials. They also have some rooms there so that people who may have visitors coming to see them can rent a room, or they can put their name down for a room and they can stay there
Oh, nice
as part of the community. So, but the thing is that there was a salutogenic biophilic approach to all of this because people had a hands-on work with their own environment. It's a shared environment. They got their own little patch, but there's a greater sort of shared ownership and shared work outside, which generates some of this social thing. This just being in a nature atmosphere. You've got water, which is really important for that spirit of place, and so on and so forth. So that's did end up winning the Healthy City Design Awards for healthy homes and neighborhoods, which we're very pleased about. And shows that it can be done at that small scale, but the thinking is still the big scale. So you don't change the ideas, you're thinking outwards, how is this going to affect the big thing? And then how are those things which are affecting the larger scale, how do we deal with them on our side? So you should have this kind of flexible, stretchy way of thinking. And this is what systems thinking is all about. It's thinking about all these different inputs and processing them rather than just saying, I've got to deal with this bit and I'll solve that. Then I'll solve this one. And I don't think that's the right way of doing it.
Absolutely not. Oh, Luke, we're getting near, we've got to the end. So and there's so many other questions that I want to ask you. So I'm going to have to invite you back at some stage. So the final question, Luke, if you could paint the world with a magic brush of biophilia, what would it look like?
What would it look like? Well, Edward O. Wilson, who wrote that Biophilia book in 1984, one of his last books before he died, which is only a couple of years ago, was called Half Earth, where he thought that half the Earth should be for nature. Not a great lump of it, but I think it's the equivalent of half of Earth. I think that would be a fantastic way to go in the direction we need to go, because we need all the benefits by keeping the earth living and resilient to changes which are happening. We can't just raid it. That's happening at the moment, and we're seeing it, and they're going to get it one way or another. Well, we can't let that happen. And I think that the biophilic idea is really important. And I remember attending the first Biophilic Design Congress at Cornell, which was 12 years ago. My old colleague Mike was giving a keynote there using a lot of the projects that both I and he had done prior to that by way of explanation. And then we held 2 days of workshops about taking it forward. It was really interesting. And I think that it is about infusing everything. So even if you've only got a windowsill, grow something on it. Or you've got a doorstep, put a pot outside the front. And if you've got a garden, then don't pave it over, and certainly don't use astroturf. And I've been seeing quite a lot of astroturf gardens recently. Just have something that's living. So you could start in very small ways, because the cumulative benefit of all these small actions builds up to something really big. Not only is it more attractive, but actually it makes you healthier and probably wealthier as a consequence.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.